Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to week 5 of Flourish. I hope everybody is having a good Monday. Actually, it's Labor Day today. Of course, we don't have a live class today because our offices are closed, so I'm off for the day. But anyway, I did this recording for you so you can, look over this. And then if you have any questions next week when we meet actually in class, I can definitely answer that. As you can see here, your weekly tracker is due today. Now, if you're not working today, you can definitely turn it in tomorrow or the next day so you can ensure that you get credit for it, okay? Now, we're going to go ahead and get started. What we're going to do today, like we do every week, we're going to recap last week's topic and then target. And then we're going to get to the topic of the day, and we're still on the Flourish Foundation of Nutrition. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the last food group, which is your dairy products. And then we're going to look at your different types of dietary fats, which ones to choose, which ones to limit as much as possible, and then herbs in order to spice up your foods, okay? After that, we're going to remind you about, or we're going to give you next week's or the target for this week. And then we'll remind you about next Monday's tracker, okay? And then I won't answer questions since this is a recording, but I can next week when we meet again. All right, so let's look here at the recap. If you do recall in last week's class, we talked about the other two food groups and how they fit on a plate in relation to kind of the proper portions, okay? First thing is we looked at your protein, which your protein, when you're visually looking at your plate and to portion out that properly, a quarter of your plate should be from your protein sources. If you do recall last week, we said you can get protein from both your animal sources and your plant sources, all right? And then we said that your protein sources, your tip to control the quality of that is to go lean with proteins. And that's specifically talking about your animal proteins, which can have the saturated fat and it can have more calories, all right? Whereas your plant protein sources are automatically lean sources. Of course, if you do recall, there's so many benefits with consuming protein. It can help control your appetite, which is very important, and your blood sugar. And then we looked at the grains last week, the other food group, and how that would visually look on your plate as far as portions. And that would be, again, the quarter of the plate. Of course, there's benefits with these grains. As you can see there, they have the dietary fiber, your B vitamins and minerals. The fiber that's in there may help reduce your risk of heart disease and cancer, and it does help with blood sugar control, appetite, and digestion. But we also said that the tip for your grains when you're choosing grains is to choose whole grains over those refined grains. For example, choose whole wheat or whole grain breads over white breads, all right? So again, just a recap of last week's topic, okay? And then last week's target, we said to think about your next meal. And with that, how you can incorporate a healthy protein, kind of that lean animal protein source and or those plant proteins, and how to incorporate those whole grain foods into your plate. Of course, since this is a recording, I do always have a question related to that, and you can see those two questions there. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move on. And what we're going to do today, when you look at balancing a healthy plate, we've obviously looked specifically at the plate, that visual representation of how to properly portion out these food groups. Like we said, at least half of your plate should be full of vegetables and fruits. And, we talked about those whole foods over those minimally processed ones. Like we just reviewed over. A quarter of your plate should be the protein sources, and the other quarter should be those whole grains. So let's kind of look today beyond the plate, outside of the plate that can supplement your diet. And that's specifically your dairy products, the healthy fats, and herbs and spices. Okay. So what we're going to do, we're first going to start talking about your dairy products. Then we're going to look at those dietary fats, specifically focusing on those healthy fats. And then we'll look at herbs and spices. So with your dairy products, this food group includes your milk, your yogurts, and your cheeses. Of course, all of this information is in your booklet. As you can see at the very top of the page, it'll show you the page numbers. So with your dairy products, you can get protein with these dairy products. Also, with these dairy products, you can get your micronutrients. And you can see here on the PowerPoint, calcium, your different vitamins, your different minerals that you can get, which is very important for the proper functioning of your body. Also with dairy products, they have those probiotics in those cultured dairy products that can be important for your gut health. And that would be things like your yogurts, your cottage cheese, and kefir. Now, when you're choosing dairy products, the tip, kind of two tips here, is number one, to choose those low fat to fat-free versions. When you do that, you're going to lower, if not eliminate, that harmful saturated fat, and you're also going to lower the calorie content. Also be careful when you're choosing those proteins, those dairy products, to choose the unsweetened versions. Typically, you'll see that in things like yogurts that are sweetened with added sugars, and you want to make sure you're getting those yogurts. If it's got any type of sweetness in it, it's come from the natural sugars and not those added sugars. Same thing with milks. You want to get those unsweetened versions, etc. Okay, so that's important with those dairy products. All right, now that's going to take us to your dietary fats. Now, dietary fats, they are essential for energy, cell function, absorption of some nutrients, and hormone production. Now, there are 4 types of dietary fats that we'll talk about. You have 2 of these, which are your unhealthy versions, and that is your saturated fats and your trans fats. And then you have the 2 healthier versions, which is your mono and your polyunsaturated fats. Now, if you look over to the bottom right of the PowerPoint, it says caution. Dietary fats are calorically dense, meaning they have a lot of calories in a certain volume or weight of food. Okay, so regardless if they're the unhealthy fats or the healthier fats, they still have 9 calories in a gram, but they do vary nutritionally. So let's look at that here. And this information does come from the American Heart Association. It is in your book here that you can definitely look, but definitely it talks about replacing those harmful saturated fats with those healthy unsaturated fats. All right, if you look at the top, it says here, it's going to break it down into love it, limit it, and lose it. All right, and at the top where it says love it, this is meaning to love those healthier unsaturated fats. These specifically are called your poly and your mono unsaturated fats. Now you may say, well, where do you find these healthy fats? Well, you can find those in your fish, especially that kind of fatty fish like salmon, tuna, mackerel, etc. Also, you find these healthy fats in nuts and seeds, also in tofu and edamame, and your plant oils, like, for example, olive oil. Okay, now the reason we want these healthy fats is they've been shown to lower that bad cholesterol, triglycerides, and improve your overall risk of not developing heart disease. Okay, and then you look below, it says to limit the saturated or harmful fat. Now, where do you find this harmful saturated fat? Well, mostly you're going to find these in your animal products. So your fatty meats, things like your red meats, your pork, that's where you're typically going to find those higher concentrations of saturated fats. That's what we talked about when you get those animal sources of proteins, especially your red meats, your pork, is to make sure you go lean, because when you do that, you're going to help lower that harmful saturated fats. You also can find those harmful saturated fats in the full fat or the whole dairy products. That's why we talked about the tips is to choose a low fat to fat free versions. And then saturated fat can be found in 2 tropical cooking oils like coconut oil and palm kernel oil. Now, you want to limit these saturated fats in your diet because they do raise that bad cholesterol and increase your risk of heart disease. And then lastly, it says to lose it. And that's those other bad fats, which are your trans fats and your hydrogenated oils. And typically you find these in these ultra processed foods like fried foods, baked packaged goods, and other highly processed foods. Now, these are really bad because they raise that bad cholesterol, and they also can affect your good cholesterol, which in turn can elevate your risk of developing heart disease. Now, a good thing about these trans fats, these hydrogenated oils, manufacturers actually have been banned from adding these artificial trans fats and partially hydrogenated oils to processed foods. Now, they still legally can put a very minute amount in, but legally they're not supposed to put over 0.5 grams in a serving of that. So again, with these types of dietary fats, you want to love those unsaturated fats, the mono and the polyunsaturated fats, limit the saturated fats, and lose the trans fats. Okay? All right. See my little blocks come up here. And now I want to just show you some examples of doing just some simple swaps, to change your dietary fats. The first box up here on your PowerPoint, it just gives you some examples. And I won't go over all of these. You'll be able to see these on your PowerPoint. We're going to look at swaps to help you lower that harmful saturated fat while keeping your meals satisfying, okay? Some examples here, and I'm going to go ahead and click these, and you can look at these, all right? For example, you can swap in a sirloin steak or maybe a beef tenderloin, and you can swap out that ribeye or that prime rib. Okay. Another way to lower the saturated fats in your diet while keeping meals satisfied, you can swap in that 93.7 ground beef or ground turkey and swap out the 80/20 ground beef. Also, when you think of poultry, you can swap in that baked or grilled chicken, swap out the fried chicken. And then when you look at your dairy products, you can swap in the low fat or the fat free cheeses and swap out the regular cheese. And then when you look at kind of your spreads or your oils, you can swap in that olive oil spread and swap out butter. And then you can do something like swapping in light mayonnaise and swapping out that full fat mayo. Again, this can help you lower saturated fats, just making those simple swaps in your diet. All right. And then you can look at the swaps to replace those harmful saturated fats with those healthy unsaturated fats. All right. For example, you can swap in salmon and you can swap out meat. That's a good way to get those healthy fats. You can swap in, another example would be soy products like tofu and swap out meat. You can also swap in olive oil and swap out the butter. 2 more examples, you can swap in nuts and then swap out the potato chips. And then lastly, you can swap in avocado and swap out the cream cheese. Okay, so again, those are examples or swaps to replace those harmful saturated fats with unsaturated fats. All right, which now takes us to this last portion, herbs and spices. Again, this is in your booklet. And with herbs and spices here, the benefits, they do have antioxidant benefits, they're antiviral and antimicrobial. Also, they enhance flavor. They do have the potential to reduce inflammation in the body. And it's a great way to season your foods without using additional salt. Okay. Now, you can view over this here. This is in your booklet, this exact thing here, but it shows you the different type of food items and the specific herbs and spices that pair well with this. So it tells you about your beef, your chicken, eggs, fish, lamb, pork, veal, using vegetables, and also desserts. So again, you can look over either this PowerPoint or look in your booklet and see how to do that, okay? All right. Whoop. Jumping ahead here on my PowerPoint. All right, which now takes us to your target for the week. And it says here to take some time to think about the dietary fats that you're eating. Are you eating more saturated fats? Are you eating more unsaturated fats? And it says think about 2 swaps to lower that saturated fat in your diet, and think about 1 swap to replace that saturated fat with an unsaturated fat. Okay. And then when we meet live next week, you can kind of respond to that. And then also next week, we're going to be talking about rethinking your drink, specifically looking at water intake, which is one of your Flourish foundations. Okay. And then next Monday, like I do every Monday, I will be emailing you the next weekly tracker. All right. And of course, I know you don't have any questions because we're recording this session here. So I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Think about those dietary fats and simply how to make those swaps. And then next week, I will, ask you some questions related to that. And as far as today's weekly tracker, if you don't submit it today, you may be out of the office. You can submit it tomorrow. Okay. All right. Well, you all have a great rest of your day, and I will see you all next time. Thank you.